early preschool age when they're starting to do things a lot more independently. You might have nights where your child's not staying in their own room. Around the age of 5 or 6, you notice that your children are having a significant difficulty with sleeping on their own, being in their own room. This is when you might want to pay a little bit more attention to what's happening at night.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jodie Richardson, and you're listening to Well, Hello Anxiety, a podcast where we end the struggle with anxiety and build our toolkit of practical skills to thrive. While so many of us long to put our heads on the pillow at the end of the day, going to bed marks the start of an often daily struggle for countless kids and teens who experience bedtime anxiety and nighttime fears. Today's wonderful guest, Dr. Krystal Lewis, is a world-renowned expert in child and adolescent anxiety. She is a clinical psychologist with the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States, as well as at her small private practice in Maryland. And just for those of you who, I'm always curious about geography, Maryland is less than an hour's drive from the White House in Washington towards the East Coast. And just a reminder for those of you who are not familiar with where I'm located, I'm south of Melbourne in Victoria in Australia on the East Coast, right down the bottom, but north of Tasmania. Dr. Lewis has a special interest in nighttime fears and recently released a really important review. And she's so passionate about understanding just how much nighttime fears impact children, but also their families, because it can be just such a difficult challenge for everybody in the house. So, Dr. Krystal Lewis, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very excited to chat with you today about nighttime fears in children and adolescents.
Oh, thank you so much. Look, it's a big challenge for families. And I look at our family and I recall that this wasn't really something that we dealt with, but there were some night terrors with one of our kids for a little while that was frightening the first time it happened for both of us, but settled down over time. But one of the things that I'm really interested in knowing is if you could start by telling us, what are nighttime fears? Like, is it essentially just feeling scared of the dark or what might be under the bed or in the cupboard or outside the window? What exactly is it?
Yeah, so that's a great place to start. Nighttime fears are pretty developmentally appropriate. What you'll see a lot of times in young kids is a fear of the dark. Many children have a fear of the dark. They have a fear of sleeping on their own at night. Sometimes their general worries tend to get worse at night, and that might look like difficulty being away from a parent or being alone in a dark room. And so there can be all types of fears that pop up at night. And what differentiates these fears from general anxiety is that they tend to occur when it gets dark outside or at night. So we call them nighttime fears, but that could include several different types of fears.
Oh, thank you. And I see that you've touched on the idea and the comparison between nighttime fears and anxiety. So the understanding is that it doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with anxiety, but it can be, can't it?
Exactly. So what we say is that parents should not be too alarmed if they see some of their children having some of these fears early on. But what we say is just to look at how severe the fears are and how interfering or distressing they become, because then there can be a diagnosis of either a specific phobia or other anxiety disorder. And so having a risk factor for an anxiety disorder doesn't necessarily mean that your child's going to have anxiety. It could just be that they have a fear of the dark or fear of monsters under their bed. But typically what we look at is how disruptive that fear is in terms of family functioning and how upset the child gets to really determine if it's a little bit more than just a developmentally appropriate fear.
Oh, thank you. And it's just so hard, isn't it? It's really important, I think, for parents to have this understanding that so much of what we see when it comes to anxiety, like fear of strangers, can be developmental and very normal as part of growing up. What sort of ages would we see developmental nighttime fears to help parents kind of start to work out, oh, where does my child sort of sit on this developmental kind of spectrum?
I think that's a great question. There's a lot of variation in children. However, when you consider kids as that early preschool age, when they're starting to do things a lot more independently, you might have nights where your child's not staying in their own room, which is pretty typical. But as kids get older, and we'll look at that transition into kindergarten, so around the age of 5 or 6, and you notice that your children are having significant difficulty with sleeping on their own, being in their own room, this is when you might want to pay a little bit more attention to what's happening at night. So I would probably say that preschool age around 4 or 5. And then once they start school full time, we can have that expectation that they're able to do things a little more independently, especially at night, right? When they're getting ready for bed and when it's time to sleep in their own rooms.
Yes, and for some families, that's an ongoing challenge. And I remember having a conversation with Dr. Wendy Troxel, who's also from the US, about sharing the covers, and that was all about sleep. Strategies and ideas, and understanding just how much having somebody else in the bed, whether it's a little person or a partner, impacts our sleep. And in different parts of the world, culturally, it's very different. Like here in Australia, it's considered sort of culturally more the norm that children will sort of move from their bassinet maybe to their cot to their own bed. There are lots of families that have children who sleep with them, but typically a child is in their own room alone at night. Whereas in other parts of the world, it's very different, isn't it? Which probably impacts the likelihood of having nighttime fears, I imagine.
Yeah, very much so. I think just across all anxiety disorders, but just in terms of nighttime fears, we have to consider just cultural variations. And for one family, what may be pretty normative might be problematic for another family if they really want their children to sleep in a separate room. Certain families are more comfortable sleeping together, co sleeping. And we look at if co-sleeping is actually a sign or right a symptom of a nighttime fear, or is it just something that the family enjoys doing together. And so this is where it's really important to look at the family as a whole in terms of expectations for the child, as well as how the child responds if for whatever reason they do have to sleep on their own. So sometimes it's okay for the child to be sleeping in their parents bed, but are they able to sleep on their own if necessary, or if the parent's away at work, or if they're for some reason they're unable to, then we look at how disruptive might that be for the child, especially given their age. And so I think you raise a great point of just looking at the different cultural factors as well as family factors to really determine how much it might be a problem.
And it is, and you're exactly right. Some people, that's exactly what they want to do with their family, that the co-sleeping and sharing the covers, as Wendy would say. But there are other families who are where the parents or the parent is so desperate for change, which is hard. And we'll get to some strategies a little bit later about how we can support families to make change. But I wonder if we could go back just a step. And I've been thinking that because this isn't something that I experienced as a parent, of course, there were just the minor kind of, in the transition period of cot to bed and those sorts of things, and depending on what's happening outside, if it's stormy or what's been happening in the family, there might be nights where the kids have been a little bit reticent to sort of want to turn out the lights and go to sleep. But for families to kind of understand what to look for when it comes to nighttime fears, what sort of things will parents see that their child is experiencing? I'm thinking, is it kind of worry about going to bed? Is it more once the lights are out? How does it show so families can start to think, oh, this is definitely something we're living with at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's an important consideration. There will be differences between younger children and adolescents, but there will be signs, I would say, of a child when they become anxious. Sometimes it occurs right when the sun goes down and it's starting to get dark outside. Sometimes it might not be until the parents announce, okay, it's bedtime. But essentially, with younger kids, you might see children getting a little bit more emotional, or they might start crying or getting a little more clingy in the evening. You'll see avoidance behaviors. So children will not want to go into their nighttime routine of brushing their teeth or putting their PJs on. So you might have more difficulties behaviorally with your children during that time. And then you might have more behavioral outbursts as well. And so with older kids, sometimes you might see more variations in their mood. So getting very irritable. And so it's a little less typical, we would say, for a preteen or a teen to have this fear of sleeping alone at night. But when it is there, it might manifest a little differently in that they have more, like I said, irritability or mood kind of fluctuations, or they're just arguing more with their parents or siblings, anything to prolong that separation from the family to sleep on their own. So there are many things that parents can look for, but as I mentioned, for one of the things you would just look at changes in mood, you would look at changes in behavior or disruptive behavior. Sometimes younger ones might complain of stomach aches or headaches or just kind of physical, just being sick, saying they don't feel well. So those might all be signs that the kids are feeling uncomfortable as nighttime approaches.
And it's these observations that can be a bit of a window into what's happening because an older child, if you check in, and I guess this is a great time to say that it's important, I think, for us as parents, even though our kids might be going to bed at night independently, for us to regularly check in on how they're going and how they are sleeping, because so much of the what kind of prompts these behaviors is are these private experiences of these thoughts and these sensations that young people won't necessarily be able to articulate. Really young kids won't necessarily, but older children, teenagers will if we ask the right questions, but they might not volunteer that they're having struggles at night. So for parents who have young people, what sort of thoughts might these children be experiencing that are prompting these avoidance behaviors? What are they worried about?
I would say, again, that could vary across kids, but some common themes you'll see for younger kids is a fear that something bad will happen. So that might be that someone scary is going to come in the house and get them. So being kidnapped or their parents being hurt, which sometimes these fears are related to more separation anxiety worries, but still related to nighttime fear. For the little ones, it might be fear that there's something scary under their bed or in their closet in their room that prevents them from being in the room by themselves. They might articulate that they're just feeling scared, so they may not quite know what it is, but they'll say that they're scared or they'll start crying. As kids get older, cognitively, they're able to kind of tap in a little bit more to the worries that they have or what they're thinking. And so then they might express their actual worries about, like I mentioned, someone coming in the house or maybe something bad happening to the parents. They might have difficulty falling asleep if both parents aren't in the home. So now they're worried about mom when she's coming home and it's dark at night, or dad's not in yet from work. So it really just depends. But these might be some of the fears, but typically it's harm to a family member or harm to themselves, or just kind of seeing something scary. Sometimes these fears might manifest after the kids are watching something scary on TV, or maybe during
Yes.
Halloween or other times of the year.
Yes, I can certainly understand how that could happen. Definitely for young kids going trick or treating and everyone being so excited and dressed up. But I remember we used to watch a lot of Scooby Doo, and when the kids were little, I don't know if you've seen much of Scooby Doo in your time, but I
Mhm.
remember the classic. The people in the masks look scary, but it's always just a regular old person in the mask. And so, thank you for explaining that for us because I think that when it comes to anxiety, as we both know, that the behaviors are the things that we can observe, but they can belie so much of what's happening underneath the surface when it comes to what kids are thinking and how they're feeling in their bodies. And I also know that it's so disruptive, as you well know and have written about and speak about, that it's really hard for parents because it's frustrating, isn't it, for parents who might want to sleep alone, or this has been going on for a very, very long time, and parents understand that it's important to have compassion and empathy, but feel also frustrated that this isn't stopping, this isn't changing. I just want a little bit of alone time at night. I just want my child to go to bed without any kind of hassle. What do you say to parents who are sort of in the midst of that kind of struggle?
Oh, I think that's quite common. You'll see both sides of it where parents don't want to see their children feeling upset or distressed. So they often, what we say, kind of accommodate and give in a lot to just get their child to do what they want. As in, I want them to stay in their room. And so okay, we'll just keep the room light on or make these accommodations that in the long run really aren't that helpful. But in the moment when the parent's feeling really frustrated and, well, I just want to watch the show with with my husband and I want my child to stay in their room, they often might engage in these behaviors that seem helpful in the moment, but they may not be.
Mm,
And something we talk to parents about is just helping them to understand what their child is feeling and why. So, a lot of times it might be hard for parents and families to understand why their child is expressing this fear or seeming so fearful. And so, we just talk through how they can help in the moment. And so this might be just teaching the family regulation strategies, especially if the child is behaviorally dysregulated, emotionally dysregulated. The first thing we start with is just what's called psychoeducation. So we'll talk to parents about what fear is, what anxiety is, why children experience it, and then certain things that we could do step by step to help them in the moment. But to your point, I do think it can be very frustrating. And then often parents are just accommodating. So it might be instead of being woken up 1 a.m. every single night, they just have their child sleep in their room. Like, you know what, instead of waiting for them to come wake us up, let's just let them sleep in our room. Or dad will be sleeping on the floor in the child's room, which again, it makes the evenings go quicker. Child falls asleep, right? But it's really disruptive to the family as a whole and prolongs the problem.
yes, yes. It's I can just picture that, the parent on the floor in the room, and oh goodness, the disruption, but also that desperation to just
Exactly.
get some sleep, and like you say, prolonging the challenge. But
Hmm.
it can be easy, can't it, for parents to kind of go, I'll deal with it when I'm feel more equipped, or I feel a bit stronger, or I feel a bit more rested. And yes, and then it just sort of, I guess, starts to reinforce what's happening, which can, am I right in suggesting that it can make it harder to kind of break those patterns?
Exactly, right. And the tough thing with nighttime fears is it is disruptive to sleep for not just the child, but the parents as well. So now you have on top of it that everybody is a little sleep deprived. So we're shorter with our tempers and more irritability. And so it just creates this cycle. But it is difficult at night to really set boundaries or be strict with your child because you want them to just be able to go to sleep or you want to be able to do your own thing. So it's important we talk to parents. They either might feel very frustrated or they might totally relate to what their child's feeling because maybe they have some anxiety themselves. Or a lot of times I'll hear parents say, well, that was me when I was 8 years old. And so they have so much compassion. It's really hard for them to help their child through it as opposed to just accommodating and trying to make them feel safe and make them feel that there's nothing to be afraid of. But in turn, what they're actually doing is reinforcing that fear by accommodating or telling their child, well, this is hard for you. We know you can't handle it. So I'm just going to stay in the room with you. Right. And so we really have to work with parents on identifying those behavior patterns in the parents as well.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the wonderful work of a retired child and adolescent psychologist, Dr. Chris McCurry. He's in Seattle, but he talks about the anxiety dance and how there's an activator. It's A, B, C, D. The activator is going to bed. B is the behavior. C are the consequences, that the that what do the parents do next, and that becomes this pattern that repeats, and that's the D is the dance. And I think it's such a nice way to kind of describe how these patterns emerge through just pure survival, don't they? With a parent going, because it starts at some point. It starts. I guess parents don't recognize necessarily that they're in a pattern before they're in a pattern.
Right, right. No, that's very true. And I think it's both ends where a young child can express these fears. And when the parent recognizes that very early on, might end up playing into those fears and modeling certain behaviors that then increase the child's fears, or the parent might constantly talk about the danger that happens at night or do certain things that are increasing the child's fear over time. So you just kind of end up in this pattern where the child's fearful, the parent's fearful, and it just goes round and round and increasing or exacerbating the anxiety.
Oh, yes, which makes it so hard. Oh, so hard. I'm just so thrilled to have this opportunity to talk with you, because you are just extraordinary in your work that you do with children, adolescents, and families. And I wanted to go back to something that you said a little bit earlier and just revisit for a moment, because you used the words dysregulated and regulated around how a child can become dysregulated and parents can help regulate. Can you tell us a little bit more about that for people who are listening who might not have a good understanding, who might have heard this before but aren't really quite sure exactly what does that mean?
Sure. I do think it's important to help educate parents as to what that means, right? So, what does that look like when your child might become dysregulated? We use that word really just to identify if a child's experiencing an intense emotional experience, it might be anxiety, it might be anger, what happens during that time. And so, it might be a manifestation of the child is crying and screaming. It could be that the child is throwing their toys or maybe even being aggressive towards you. And we look at, are you able to disrupt that cycle, help the child to regulate the emotion? And essentially what that means is maybe we start engaging in some deep breathing with our child, or we suggest utilizing some tools to help them calm down in the moment. Sometimes kids really struggle with that though. And so that's when we say that the more dysregulated the kids are, it might be harder to get at what's actually going on. So that's not the time when they're screaming and throwing their toys to try to have a conversation about what they're afraid of or why they won't go to bed. And you end up engaging in a back and forth. That's the time to really just sit and help them to regulate that emotion. And a lot of times it happens right before bed, or it happens maybe in the morning when you're trying to get out the door to school. So it's not the ideal time to slow down and help them, but that's really what's necessary. When I use the term dysregulated, especially with anxiety, we think of like the fight or flight response, right? So we say that the amygdala is activated, so the child is scared of something, and now they're in a physiological state. So their heart's racing, they're feeling really upset. It's a lot harder to just sit and have a conversation when that happens, especially when a child is very young. And so it's important to learn and teach them tools to use to help calm down before having that conversation with them.
Oh, thank you very much for explaining that so beautifully. And the idea of breathing as a tool is it's so powerful. And what you were saying about the times at which this occurs can be just so inconvenient, can't they, for for families? And like you say, whether or not it's nighttime fears or it's going to school, which could be related to separation anxiety, or any other time that these instances kind of overflow in family life, it can be really difficult. And so it's appropriate time for me to suggest to parents that it's really great if you can practice these strategies yourself.
Exactly. Yes, it's something I always say. Try to make it a family activity where we're all practicing these skills. Um, and especially at night, it's important really to help teach your child how to manage those emotions a little bit more. But then there's this fine line between teaching them that the anxiety is dangerous or the fear is dangerous. So that's where you have to be careful just in terms of how much you're encouraging that breathing when they're upset. And it's more of just, well, we're taking some deep breaths and we're regulating so we can have a conversation about whatever is bothering us, but then we're still doing the behavior, right? So a lot of times parents at that point will then back off from having the child go upstairs and brush their teeth or do whatever the behavior is that caused the anxiety. And we're teaching them, well, you're feeling this uncomfortable feeling. We're going to do some breathing to get you to calm down. And then that's it. And so the child's learning, like, oh, this anxiety is a problem, right? I need to manage the anxiety. But then they don't learn. It's more so we're trying to help them with the behavior. And so that's also where, when you get to a point where a child might have a clinical anxiety disorder or it's disruptive and they're working with a therapist, where that's where the parents learn how to kind of differentiate and draw that line and still push the children to do what's developmentally appropriate at that point.
Yes, and it's a question I'm so often asked is how much do I push, for want of a better expression? And it's so hard. It's not something I'll ask you to comment, but it's so contextual, isn't it? And age and what's happening, and
Mm.
where you're at in your journey. It's one of these challenging questions to answer. But what would you sort of, as a general comment, like to say to parents who are like, I know that I accommodation, is not helpful. I know that it's important for my child to experience this discomfort, understand what's happening and still move forward. But it's hard for them because it's upsetting.
Right.
What would you say?
That's really good because I work with a lot of parents, and that's the concern of I don't want to push too hard, right? I don't want to push my child
Yeah.
too hard because it makes them upset. And I think we really just talk through, well, in the moment, it's uncomfortable for you as a parent to see your child uncomfortable, but the goal is to get them less uncomfortable. So even in the moment, if it's increasing your distress over time, we know that this is going to help the child. And so it's really looking at how interfering the behaviors are for the family. There's a difference between maybe this comes up only around Halloween, right? The nighttime fears, and maybe the family went to see a scary movie. So if it's just a handful of times, then it's okay. It might be okay to accommodate. We're not going to push. You could sleep in our bed tonight. But if this is really, maybe a nightly issue and it's really interfering with the family functioning or the events that are occurring at night, then you have to look at the long term of in the moment. It's very uncomfortable as a parent to see your child and pushing them, but knowing that in the long run, you're helping them to feel less distressed in the long run. But it is a fine line. I know it is difficult, but that's part of what we talk through of what makes sense for each family and for each child.
They're so lucky to be able to work with someone like you who can really support them, because it is anxiety is just such a family affair, isn't it? And because that of the genetic predisposition, there can definitely be another anxious person in the house, or maybe more when a child is struggling, can't there?
Yes, yes. We do see that a lot. We say that there is that genetic predisposition. I think it's also important that parents recognize that one risk factor doesn't necessarily mean that their child's going to be anxious if you're an anxious parent. But we do want to highlight if you are an anxious parent, then looking at potentially your behaviors or what you're modeling and how you could change those behaviors yourself to ensure that your child then is able to kind of get through scary situations and ultimately maybe not develop anxiety. But you're exactly right with that. It is a family affair. It's important parents are aware of their behaviors. They interact with their kids and help their kids through some of these situations. And I think again, when parents feel like there is a concern that goes beyond some of the typical fears that we see in children, that it's important to reach out for help, work with a therapist, look things up online. There are many validated evidence-based websites and resources that parents could use. And if there's any question, reaching out to your medical provider, child's pediatrician and doctor and talking through, maybe we could use some more help.
That's so lovely that you're able to suggest that there are some online resources, and I might ask you to share those with us so I can put those in the show notes, because what we're finding here, and I'm not sure, I'd be interested to know what you're finding in the US or
Mhm.
in Maryland where you are, is that there is a huge wait for, because of, particularly here in Melbourne, because we were, I'm not sure if we still are because of what's happening in China, but one of the most locked down cities in the world during the pandemic. We had huge lockdowns with great restrictions. We had a 5K radius limit on how far we could venture from our homes. We were only allowed to exercise for 1 hour a day or leave the house for 1 hour a day. And we had at one stage even a curfew of 8 o'clock at night, and homeschooling for months. It was really difficult. And so psychology appointments are hard to come by because there's been a great rise in child and adolescent anxiety and depression. So sharing some online resources that parents can look to is more important than ever before here, because that can be sort of a bit of a stopgap or something to support families between recognizing that there's a challenge and then getting in to see somebody. Even though one of my other beautiful guests suggested beautifully that obviously the GP or the pediatrician are a really great support, and
Mhm.
there's no harm. In fact, there's a lot of good that will come from making regular appointments with the GP while waiting to see a therapist, a psychologist, a counsellor. So online resources are just, yeah, needed more than ever. So thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
Before we talk about what parents can do, I just wondered if you could touch, please, on the importance of sleep when it comes to anxiety in general, because we know that nighttime fears are certainly treatable. There's a lot that families can do, whether or not they're working through some of the suggestions that you share today, or working with somebody who can really support them. And that it won't always be like this for families, whatever it is that you're going through, that there is a lot that you can do to make change. But one of the, I think, great reasons to develop that willingness to go through the discomfort of change is that understanding that sleep is just so powerful when it comes to anxiety that, and as somebody who lives with anxiety, Crystal, it's something that I just protect fiercely for myself. And my husband will jokingly say how, yes, he certainly can see when I haven't slept well, how it can impact my mood, and how I just can recognize that my anxieties develops more quickly. I'm much more irritable. But
Mhm.
we also know how disrupted sleep can get because of anxiety. So it's a bit of a challenge. Can you just share with us a little bit about the importance of sleep for our good mental health?
Sure. I think that's a great point. We know children as well as adolescents need a good amount of sleep, and there's a significant correlation between anxiety and sleep disruption and sleep disorders. And so that is something that I talk to parents a lot about is how to maximize how much sleep their child's getting. And oftentimes with nighttime fears, that is disrupting their sleep process if that means they're either going to sleep a lot later than they should be going to sleep, or they're waking up in the middle of the night and having disrupted sleep. And so then throughout the day, the child might be either a little more irritable or more anxious, just like you mentioned. They do go hand in hand. And I think there's a challenge as well with teenagers who don't quite want to
Hmm.
go to sleep early and them not getting enough sleep as well. And some of that is developmentally appropriate where their sleep schedules are a little bit different, right? But I talk to parents a lot about how much sleep is recommended and how to help their children and adolescents to sleep in the evening. And so sometimes this is where we might introduce some family activities of doing some mindfulness or meditation before bed, doing something to help settle down the household, to help with that transition to sleep. And then, if necessary, I do have some parents who are interested in having their child take melatonin, which can help with their sleep if they're having ongoing sleep issues. But to your point, there is a significant correlation between sleep and anxiety, and so we do focus on that a lot in treatment.
It's interesting. Melatonin here is by prescription only, unless you are, I think, 65 or older. But I should say that you can purchase it online and have it delivered to your home. So it's something that parents have access to. What would you say to parents who are maybe considering melatonin for their children? Obviously, we would say please seek professional
Of course,
guidance.
right,
Uh,
right.
so because it's not really something that you would want your children to be relying on long term, is it?
No, and I think to your point, it is important that they talk to the medical professional. So that would be like the child's GP or pediatrician. But when you do have a child who has significant sleep difficulties, the importance of sleep sometimes outweighs the concern about the child taking melatonin. So if you are using a sleep aid that's not going to be for a long period of time, you could just use it in the moment until you're getting other help for your child, especially if it's related to anxiety, worries, and nighttime fears. You can work with a therapist to focus on those things. But in the meantime, if it is significantly disruptful, you do want to make sure your child's getting enough sleep because that's affecting development as well. So I would say just to consider all options, but talking to your GP to see what might make the most sense. And I see, and as you mentioned, it's a little bit different here in the States, right? Where parents can get melatonin or gummies, sleep gummies, and different things that they might give their children to help with the sleep difficulties.
Yeah, it's really interesting to touch on these ideas and these tools because we develop a toolkit, don't we, when it comes to supporting our kids with their anxiety and nighttime fears. And it's one tool in a toolkit, but a tool that is necessary, absolutely necessary under certain circumstances. And here in Australia, that it's certainly prescription only. But if you're listening in other parts of the world, as I know I have listeners all over the world, which is absolutely wonderful, then you'll be able to talk to your GP about what you can do and what's the best approach. So, what can parents do? How can parents start to address this issue in their homes with their children? What are some of the things that you could use? For example, some people might already be using, say, a nightlight, for example,
Mhm.
to help a child sort of transition into being able to sort of sleep more comfortably on their own. What are some of the strategies that you suggest and teach parents?
I think we always start with just having open conversations about it. So kids are super smart. And so it's really important parents are open with them in terms of if there is a particular issue or difficulty that the conversations are being had at home. And so before even getting to specific strategies, it might be maybe finding some developmentally appropriate, age appropriate books to read on fear of the dark or nighttime fears. With older kids, you can just have the conversations. If maybe as a parent you have some difficulties at night as well, just bringing it up and talking together as a family, and then coming up with a plan for, well, how are we going to attack this, right? How are we going to strategize to help the family or help us in this situation? So night lights, I think, are very popular. Parents will use night lights in the child's room, or they'll want a very dim light, a lamp, like a reading lamp that they use. We don't recommend that you keep the bedroom light on, but you might want to have a hallway light on and have the door cracked, or some small light source that could be helpful. That can be a first step. And sometimes for younger kids, it could be helpful to have maybe just, their favorite stuffed animal or something that makes them feel safe to begin with. So we're starting the process of getting them to be on their own. So you might want to just go buy a special toy, or not a toy, but, a stuffed animal or action figure that they want. And that'll be like their buddy at night. But the biggest thing really is exposure to the dark. And so a lot of the work that I do with parents is exposure therapy as part of cognitive behavioral therapy. So helping parents to come up with a plan for exposing the child to the dark. The child's trying as hard as they can to not be in the dark or not be by themselves. And so to reverse that and figure out how we start really small, really slowly to get the child to do things more independently at home. And again, it's just an open conversation so the child knows what's happening. And maybe with younger kids, they can earn rewards or little stars step by step for doing more things at home. So it's reinforced. But those are just several of the strategies we might use. So the nightlight, or keeping the door open, giving the child a toy, talking about the process and how we're going to attack the issue, and then essentially just exposures, which might be with a therapist. It might be using bibliotherapy or specific books that are out there about nighttime fears in the dark, and it could be made very fun. So there are lots of games to play in the dark, so parents can do all types of nightlight not yeah night shadow at animals, or the glow in the dark sticks, and kind of doing hide and seek. There are many things that you can do in the dark to make it fun, but it serves as an exposure to being in the dark to help with the nighttime fears.
Oh, such clever ideas. And the shadow animals. I remember doing those with my kids just for fun because when they were little, I think one of them had a nightlight. There wasn't really a great expression of fear, but it was just a comfortability thing. They just wanted a little bit of light in their room, and
Mhm.
so I remember doing that, and having fun, and then yeah, that's a really lovely thing to be able to do, and like you say, to sort of change that idea that the dark is frightening, that the dark is scary. And one of the things that I know can happen with nighttime fears is this irrational thinking that the child can't help, but it's irrational that when they've checked the cupboard, they've checked under the bed perhaps, or a parent has said, "Oh, there's nothing under the bed, there's nothing in the cupboard," but the child will still lie there and think, "There's definitely something in my cupboard or under my bed." How do parents support children who are having these, irrational kind of ideas about what's happening?
I think that's a great question, because a lot of times you'll have parents who say, well, my child's afraid of what's in the closet. So we end up checking the closet and under the bed, and this becomes more of a ritual, which can become problematic. But I think, again, for younger kids, some of those worries are pretty normative. So it's okay to say, okay, we're going to check your closet or check under the bed. And then as kids get older, then it's more of just being able to talk through some of those irrational fears that there's something in the house. And so we're not going to check because we know that there's nothing there. So instead, we might want to lay here and do some meditation, or you're teaching them other strategies to utilize in the moment. And then, ultimately just teaching them what an anxious thought is, right? And so, depending on how interfering it is, we help kids to identify when they're having their worries. Like, well, that's a worry thought. We know that's not real. If you're thinking there's a monster under your bed and the child might be now 11 or 12 and it's not quite as developmentally appropriate, then it's like, well, we know that's
Yes.
just your worry, right? We just know that that's the worry brain, or however you want to phrase it. And then you help them to shift to something else. But I think, to your point, it is pretty common that kids will have all types of irrational fears about things happening in the dark.
Yes, yes. And you've just as we sort of draw to a close, what you've just prompted in me is thinking about separation anxiety. And I've just had our daughter's just been on school camp, and because of the lockdowns, her year level have missed 2 years of camp. So they went on camp in grade 3, missed grade 4, missed grade 5, and went on camp in grade 6. And I think what we're talking about, a lot of this is really transferable, isn't it? If the idea that going away or sleeping at someone's house or going on camp can provoke sort of worries at night, and that the separation from a parent can be more challenging in families at the moment, I think, because of what we've endured here in terms of all being together for so long without separation. And
Mhm.
so I just invite parents who are struggling with these sorts of challenges in their home to maybe reflect on how some of, or much of what Crystal's saying, what you're saying is interesting to think about when it comes to other types of anxiety as well, because there'll be a lot of transfer there when it comes to psychoeducation and regulation and identifying anxious thoughts and exposure and things like that. So before we finish up, is there anything else that you would love to share with parents of children who are experiencing nighttime fears before we find out how we can all connect with you and follow your wonderful work?
So I think you just touch on something that's quite important, especially for these times, is that we have seen an increase in child anxiety, and that could be nighttime fears and just child mood in general, mood issues. And so during this time, for parents to be more aware of the behaviors that they're seeing in their children, and knowing that there are steps that they can take, and that might be looking up things online to identify whether these behaviors are problematic. It could be reading some books. There are a lot of great books out there, especially for anxious children and anxious adolescents. And that might be a great place to start, to just kind of read these things together. But although anxiety is quite common in children, adolescents, and adults, it's also
Mm.
highly treatable. And so nighttime fears in kids, if you do think that it is interfering, it's quite distressing, it's easy for me to say don't stress about it. But as a parent, know that there are a
Mm.
lot of things out there to help treating your child. And so I would highly recommend either connecting with your medical doctor, or looking up things again on validated websites to determine whether you need to intervene. And the earlier you intervene, it could be better for your child. So I wouldn't hesitate to reach out for help.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And so, where can our listeners learn more about you and connect with you? And also, could you share with us a couple of websites that you would recommend our listeners can go to if they would like to learn more and have a trusted place to understand more about what they can do?
Sure. I would say I can either be contacted on LinkedIn. And so essentially, you would just search my first name, Crystal, last name, Lewis, and I can be messaged that way. And then I do have a relatively active Twitter account, which would be Dr. Krystal Lewis, where I try to disseminate some, scientific information in terms of research. And I'm also listed on the Anxiety and Depression Association of America website. So I am a board member with that organization, which is a great place to get some of these resources that I'm going to mention. But it's adaa.org, and they have a lot of information for child anxiety as well as adults. And I would recommend going to our government website. So we do have www.nimh.nih.gov, and you would search the child and adolescent mental health. And so they have tabs listed for anxiety and depression and just any type of child and adolescent mental health problem. And then lastly, I would say also utilizing the CDC website. They also have validated resources listed. And I think if anyone wants any more kind of resources, they can either reach out to me, or we could list them. There are plenty of great books, as I mentioned, that I utilize all the time with my kids that can easily be purchased on Amazon, as well as some great websites that are either through Canada or actually Australia. There's anxiety specialist as well.
Yes.
Yes. So there are a lot of great resources out there.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And what I might ask you to do is to pop a few of those book titles in an email, if that's okay. And
Certainly.
I'll add those to the show notes. So anyone listening can go direct to this episode, scroll to the notes, and all of those links will be there. And I'll have that link to your LinkedIn page and all of those websites as well. Krystal, thank you so much for sharing with us so generously today. You've supported parents in profound ways, and I know that you will have given a lot of families hope and so many practical ways that they can move forward, as well as being able to identify whether or not this is something that it's time to get some help with. And as you mentioned so beautifully at the end there, it is treatable. There is
Mhm.
a lot of help available. There are resources available, and you've shared so beautifully as a human resource and also directed us to some wonderful online resources, and we'll list some books as well. So thank you so much for your time. I'm so grateful.
Excellent. And I really do appreciate the invitation. I think this is a great platform on a really important topic. And so I really do hope that anyone out there with additional questions reaches out to us and listens to this podcast and shares this podcast. It has some really great information. So thank you again.
Oh, thank you so much. And yes, if you do know someone who you think might benefit from this, please share it with them, because it's hard for some people when they're in the thick of living with a child who's struggling with sleep and nighttime fears and anxiety to necessarily be able to access all of the resources that are available. And so if you could share this with somebody who you think might benefit, then please do so. Well, thank you very much for sharing your time with us today. I really always appreciate you joining me for another episode of the podcast, and I very much look forward to being back with you again next week. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. To keep the conversation going, I'd love you to join me over on Instagram. You'll find me at Dr. Jodie Richardson. Also, if you'd like a copy of my free 5-day mini email course, Calm Your Anxious Brain, then jump over to my website, drjodirichardson.com, and you can sign up down the bottom. I've really enjoyed having your company. Thanks so much. See you next time.